1 minute to midnight. Hey, I forgot to tell you, I've got 1 and Johnny's got 4. Well, it is 6:30, which means it's time for us to begin. We're glad you're here and starting the new year off with fellowship and Bible study. If you'll open up your Bibles to Romans chapter 12. Romans chapter 12 is where we are at, and a couple of weeks ago we got into Romans 12 and we spent the first couple of verses rather, we spent a whole class on those first couple of verses, and we talked about how that in Romans 12 is where there's a shift in what Paul is teaching, because he's been laying down the kind of the doctrinal basis of what he's been teaching. And in Romans 12 it begins with I appeal, or if you're reading a different translation it may say something like I beg or I beseech or something of that nature. This is one of those petition verbs which tells us you really got to pay attention to what I'm telling you now. And this is where the majority from chapter 12 through 16 of the imperatives or the commands are. So he's given us the doctrinal basis in chapters 1 through 11, and now he's given us the application of what to do about that. And as we've been talking about all along, the book of Romans is about the justification of God, or the righteousness of God. And you have two groups of people at the church at Rome. Paul's never been to the church at Rome. He hopes to go there, and history tells us that he will get there, and the Bible tells us he'll get there, but he hasn't been there yet, he tells us in this letter. But he loves them and is concerned about them, and he's writing to them about a problem that exists in a lot of the New Testament churches in the first century, and by the way, still exists today, and that's the problem of division. There were this congregation made up of Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians, and the Gentile Christians thought they were better than the Jewish Christians, and the Jewish Christians thought they were better than the Gentile Christians, and they saw each other as these two separate groups rather than seeing each other as a unified body. And so he's wanting them to see this is how God sees you, so that you'll see yourselves correctly and you'll see others correctly, the other side of the aisle, so to speak. That all of you have sinned, and the only reason that you are able to be made righteous or to be justified is by the grace of God. When you put your trust in Jesus to do for you what you can't do for yourself. And he spent 11 chapters proving that, and then he says, I appeal, or I beg you, on the mercies of God, on the basis of the fact that God has been merciful to you and has made you righteous when you didn't deserve it, then I'm appealing to you to live your life in a way that reflects that you understand that and get that. And so what he appeals is for them to present their bodies, for them not to be conformed, but instead for them to be transformed. And then starting in verse 3, he's going to get into the particulars of how that works. And right off the bat, he's going to talk about a topic that, if we get through all of what we want to talk about tonight, is one that makes us uncomfortable, I will readily admit, because if we look at it the way the Bible teaches, it doesn't always align with the way that we talk about it sometimes. And it's interesting how things... It's just so happened. I don't believe in coincidence. I believe that the Lord does things. But it's interesting how this works out, because about 6 weeks or so ago, I got to teach about this from 1 Corinthians in the Adult 2 class. And then the next week, I got to teach about this in the Middlers class from 1 Corinthians 12. And tonight, I'm going to talk about it from Romans 12. And then, little spoiler alert here, we're going to start a study of Ephesians in our Sunday morning sermons. And so here in a couple of months, we'll study again about this same idea from Ephesians 4. And you may say, well, we're really hammering that. Well, I am, because Paul's hammering that in all three of those books. And that's one of the good things about studying through books, is you just have to deal with the next section of text, whatever it is. You may not like it, but that's what the Bible says, and so that's what we're going to go with. Okay, so in Romans 12 rather. I'm getting myself confused now. In Romans chapter 12, beginning in verse 3, he says, "For," now again, this is starting the practical application of all this. "For, by the grace given to," by the way, he said that I want you to present yourself a living sacrifice. I want you to not be conformed to the world. I want you to be transformed. And we use those two verses to talk about a lot of things, but in context, what he's talking about is how you're treating each other. Okay, that's what he's been talking about this whole book, isn't it? So the way that a person in the world that was a Gentile might look down their nose at a Jew is the way the world would act, or the way that a Jew might look down their nose at a Gentile in the world might be the way the world acts, but I want you to act in a different way. We've talked about this a bunch. It's one of my, I heard this a long time ago from Will Hanstein, who's a friend of mine and was out in Denver, and now he's in East Tennessee. But Will, in a sermon one time, said, we ought not be surprised when the world acts like the world, but we ought to be surprised when the church acts like the world. And that's what he's saying. Don't act like the world in the way you treat each other. So, give us some specifics, Paul. Well, "For by the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think with sober judgment, each according to the measure of faith that God has assigned." So, "For by the grace that has been given to me." Now, one of the things, here's another spoiler alert. On Sunday nights, starting this Sunday night, we're going to start a series of lessons on how to study the Bible. And one of the things we're going to talk about in that series of lessons, we'll probably spend quite a bit of time on, is one of the things we have to do when we're studying the Bible is understand how a writer uses words. Okay? Words mean what the author intends for them to mean, right? And so we've talked about this before in various examples, like, for example, cool. What does cool mean? Well, there's a bunch of things. You might say, that Johnny Shanklin, he is one cool dude, right? Or you might say, that Johnny Shanklin acted cool to me. Two different things, isn't it? Or you might say, he's got on a thick vest, Johnny must be cool, right? All of those kinds of things. Or you might see him passed out on the floor and you might go, oh, he's done cool. There's no sense in calling. Whatever. There's all different kinds of ways. We hope that don't happen, of course, but all kinds of ways that you can define. Well, what it means is what I'm intending to express, right? In Paul, when he talks about the grace that's been given to me, he's usually talking about, almost always, he's talking about the grace given to him that allowed him to be an apostle, okay? That this role that God has given to him, this position that God has put him into, and there's a bunch of places in Ephesians, and we'll talk about them eventually, but if you'll turn over to Galatians chapter 2, let me see if I can make this font a little bit bigger. Yep, in Galatians chapter 2, Galatians 2, and we'll start in verse 7. This is Paul talk. What Paul's basically saying in this context is, I didn't get what I got from the other apostles. Jesus gave me. I'm an apostle not because I went to the other apostles and said, can I join the club? I became an apostle because Jesus said you're an apostle, and Jesus is the one that gave me the gospel that I preach. He says in verse 7, on the contrary, when they saw, and that's the other apostles, that I had been entrusted with the gospel to the uncircumcised, guess what that word for entrusted is? It's the same word for faith or belief. Now keep that in mind because we'll talk about that in just a minute. With the gospel to the uncircumcised, just as Peter had been entrusted with the gospel to the circumcised, for he who worked through Peter for his apostolic ministry to the circumcised worked also through me for mine to the Gentiles. And when James and Cephas and John, who seemed to be pillars, perceived the grace that was given to me. Now, what's he talking about in context? He's talking about the fact that I'm an apostle just like they are. See? That's the grace given to me. Then they gave me the right hand of fellowship to Barnabas and me, that we should go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised. Are you with me? So in Paul, when he's talking about this grace that's given to him, he's talking about the fact that God picked me to be an apostle. That's my gift that he's given to me. So he says, for by the grace given to me, the fact that I am an apostle, by the authority, when I do a wedding, a lot of times people say by the authority vested in me, by the state of Tennessee, I now pronounce, and I always say it because I don't have any right to, that's not my business. I'm just doing the ceremony. So I say, because you've done all this, God's already joined you as husband and wife, but by the ordinance of the state of Tennessee, I'm the first to get to pronounce you or introduce you as man and wife. Well, he's saying, by the authority vested in me as an apostle of Christ, by the power of Jesus, I say to everyone among you, and everyone among you in context of Romans would be who? Jew and Gentile, okay? It's the first of the year. We can't start off being a little quiet church mice, okay? Say it with authority, all right? Jew and Gentile. We've taken a couple weeks off, so we'll give you a pass this time. Everyone among you, Jew and Gentile, don't think of yourself more highly than you ought to think. So go back up earlier into chapter 11 and look at verse 25, and somebody read 11:25 for us. Real loud. Out loud.
Lest you be wise in your own sight, I do not want you to be unaware of this mystery, brothers. A particular...
That's good enough. Wise in your own sight is kind of like saying, think of yourself more highly than you ought to, right? Now go back up to verse 20 of chapter 11, and somebody read chapter 11 and verse 20 out loud, real loud.
That is true. They were broken off because of their unbelief, but you stand fast through faith, so do not come proud, but fear.
Proud. That's like thinking more highly of yourself than you ought to, or, what'd your verse say? Verse 25 said what? Being wise in your own sight is like saying, verse 20 said what? Being proud. Now somebody read verse 18 of chapter 11 real loud.
Do not be arrogant toward the branches.
Do not be arrogant is like saying do not be what, Daddy?
Proud.
And that's like saying do not what?
Wise.
Be wise in your own sight, which is like saying don't think more highly. Is he really hammering this? And if you go back to chapter 5 and chapter 3 is where he was telling the Jews, you don't be proud in your own eyes either. Don't think more highly. That was the problem, was that they were looking at each other as you're less than I am, because they thought they were on an elevated plane. The Jews thought they were on an elevated plane above the Gentiles. The Gentiles thought they were an elevated plane above, and they're all supposed to be one together, see? So, not to think more highly of himself than he ought to think, but to think with sober judgment or humble opinion of yourself, each according to the measure of faith that God has assigned. So, the measure of faith. In Paul, again, we're talking about the way Paul uses this is not typically talking about the faith that you have in the Lord as much as it is that you're entrusting, or you're trusting God, right? Trusting Jesus to do something for you that you're not doing yourself. Well, F.F. Bruce has a great quote about this. He talks about how that probably a good way to translate this in context would be a measure of responsibility. But that word that's translated faith is the same word that's translated in trust. So we're putting our trust in Jesus to do for us what we can't do for ourselves, make ourselves righteous. And in turn, what Jesus does is He entrusts us with these spiritual gifts. Okay? He's going to give us a spiritual gift. Now, we don't like to call it gift. What do we like to call it? Talent, right? Why do we like talent? Well, maybe there's a lot of reasons. Maybe it's because sometimes we're thinking about how to win debates with other folks rather than it is just being honest with what the text says. But what does the Bible call it? Gifts. So if we are going to be people that speaks where the Bible speaks and is silent where the Bible's silent, what ought we to call them? Gifts. Okay? But that's what he's talking about, this measure of responsibility, or this God entrusted them with a gift. Verse 4, as in one body we have many members, and the members do not all have the same function, so we, though many, are one body in Christ, and individually members one of another. So, I'll go ahead and tell you some passages you can write down. We're going to talk about some more here in just a minute. But in Romans chapter 12, I've already told you these already, but Romans chapter 12, and in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, and those of you that are in one of those adult classes where we're studying 1 Corinthians will remember this hopefully. And in Ephesians chapter 4, all three of those places he talks about spiritual gifts that we have. Okay? And in all three of those places, Paul, same author, Paul every time, Paul uses the same illustration. And the illustration that he uses is that of a body. Now, there's a lot of people in here that has medical training that knows a lot more about all of this than I do. But unfortunately, I'm the one up here talking. So this is kind of maybe not the best way to explain all this, but hopefully you get the idea of what he's saying. We sang I don't remember if this was the Wiggles or who this was, that the boys would sing the song when they were little bitty, head, shoulders, knees, and toes. You remember who that was? Huh? Was it the Wiggles? Gordon's like, nope. So anyway, it didn't stick, I don't reckon. But anyway, it's funny how many of those things that we would, like Goodnight Moon, I can quote you Goodnight Moon from cover to cover. And I don't know how many of those things, they didn't stick with the boys, but they stuck with me. So I've got a really good preschool education right now. But head, shoulders, knees, and toes, all these different body parts, and eyes and lips and mouth and nose. And you would never go, and some of you are saying, I heard you say this in a class already. Well, it's the same lesson here that Paul taught in 1 Corinthians, okay? You wouldn't go to the doctor. I wouldn't go to Tina's office and say, Tina, something is wrong with my knee. And she'd say, what's wrong? I can't smell nothing with my kneecap. I don't expect my kneecap. Even Callie thinks that's ridiculous, right? Now, she's probably a future doctor, but she's not completed her training yet. She knows that's ridiculous. See? You don't smell with your knee. Our body has all different kinds of parts. And we don't want our whole body to be the digestive system, do we? Because we want a circulatory system, and we want a nervous system, and we want a skeletal system, and all of those things. And if I don't have a certain part of my body, if I have to have a leg amputated, or if I have to have a kidney taken out or something, my body is going to suffer to some degree, right? But I don't get upset that my knee can't smell. I don't get upset that my shoulder's not pumping blood throughout the body, right? Our different parts of our body have different things that they do, and that's what makes the body work. Well, the illustration that he's making is that all of us shouldn't think less of other parts of Jesus' body because you do different things. Why does my eye see? Huh? That's what an eye. Why does an eye do that, though? Who made my eye to see? That's the way God made an eye, right? Why does my ear hear? Because God made ears to hear, right? Why does my hip move in all these different directions? Because that's the way God made it. Now, the older I get, it's not moving in quite as many directions as it used to, but That's the way God made it, see? And guess how God made us in Jesus' body? Is that we all do different things. We have different gifts, but they're all important. So, he says that we're all doing different things, but he says we are all one body. Now, how many bodies did they see? 2. What were the names of those bodies? The Jew and Gentile body, right? We went to Mount Airy, North Carolina, the hometown of Andy Griffith, for the Mayberry Days Festival several years ago. And they have a museum there that talks about all the famous people that's come out of Mount Airy. Mount Airy's maybe about the size of Martin, and not a lot of famous people has come out of there, but Andy Griffith's one of them, of course. And then they had, this was kind of odd, but they had the oldest living, or I don't know how you say that, the set of Siamese twins that lived the longest. Okay? They had 2 heads and 1 body. And you're thinking, that's weird, right? I talk to myself too much already. If I had 2 heads, that'd be 2 heads are better than 1, but not in that situation. Well, it'd be the same thing if you had 1 head and 2 bodies. That wouldn't work either, would it? And that's what they were doing, see. But you've got one body, and you need to see yourselves that way, and individually members one of another. See, my bicep might be real strong, and I might say, look at how strong my arm is, that I can curl that much weight. But guess how much my muscle's going to work if the blood's not bringing oxygen to it? And guess how much my bicep's going to work if the blood's not taking away from those cells in the muscle all of the contaminants that are there? And if the lungs aren't getting oxygen and putting it in the blood, and all those different things aren't working the way they should, they're connected, right? My arm can't say, well, I'm going to secede from the Union and walk off. You know, I think I've told you about before, when I was a little boy, we'd go to the drive-in movies between here in Union City, and sometimes one between Union City and Fulton. And I remember in the back of Daddy's truck, they put their lawn chairs up by the cab. Daddy'd back into it, and they'd have a quilt down there, and me and Bradley would be laying down there, and we'd watch the movie, and usually we'd fall asleep, and they'd all that. But there was a movie, and it was a man had his hand hanging out the window driving down the road. You remember that movie? I don't know what the name of the movie is. You're talking about scarring me for life, though. It has. And he hit a mailbox, his hand come off, and the rest of the movie, that hand is doing this, trying to get to him. And man, I've never hung my hand out the window my entire life because of that movie. It scared me so bad. That's right. But it don't work that way, does it? If my hand is gone, it's gone. And he says that that's the way we are, is we're members one of another. So verse 6, having gifts that differ. Now, where did he talk about gifts up here? Remember, he said, for by the grace given to me. He was given a gift, wasn't he? The gift of being an apostle. And he says we've got different gifts. God gave us a gift. Having different, or gifts that differ according to the grace given to us. Where did he talk about the grace given to us? Back up there earlier in verse 3. With his gift, right? So let us use them. So here's what he lists in this. He says, if prophecy or speaking for God, then do so in proportion to our faith. And I think this is, you can say that it's based on how much you believe in Jesus, but I think it's probably about how much He's entrusted you with. He says in 1 Corinthians 13, we know in part and we prophesy in part, because He didn't just, all right, Paul, here's the whole New Testament. You know, He gave it a little bit at a time, and as much as you've been given, then prophesy about that, or speak for God in that. Number 2, verse 7, if service, this is our word for ministry or deacon, if it's some sort of ministry, then use that ministry to serve or to minister to others. The one who teaches, the word means to teach or instruct. If your gift is to teach in his teaching, then use that gift in your teaching. The one who exhorts, this is the word, literally what it means is for a speaker to call one to their side. So I might say, David, would you come up here and join me? Because I want him to, well, that's what an encourager, that's what this word means, is to encourage or exhort. I'm trying to help pull you up by my side, see, so that we're on the same plane with each other. The one who contributes or gives or shares in generosity, the one who leads, the word means to rule over or to manage with zeal, the one who does acts of mercy, showing mercy, to do so with cheerfulness, and that root word for that actually means mercy. So do it in a way that you're cheerfully showing mercy to others. So there's these 7 different things that he lists are different gifts. Now, when we talk about spiritual gifts in the New Testament, how do we usually categorize them? I'm sorry, I didn't hear. Talents is what we usually call them, but we usually put them in 2 different categories. Miraculous and non-miraculous. All right, the problem is, where in the Bible does a New Testament author ever put them in those categories? And they don't, see. And in fact, when we look at this list, we would say prophecy, well, that's a miraculous thing, right? Or serving, would we say that's a miraculous gift? To serve? No. Teaching, would we say that it's a miracle? Corey got up there and taught tonight. No. The one who encourages, do you know someone who's really good at encouraging? Would we say that was miraculous? No. Contribute. I know there's people in here with that gift because I've benefited from your generosity. But we wouldn't say that was miraculous, would we? So all of these different gifts, Paul just keeps putting them in the same basket and saying these are gifts from God. And part of the problem is, again, we sometimes try to base our arguments on how do we win the debate with someone else from a different faith background, rather than just being honest with what the text says. The other problem that we have sometimes is that we usually think of miraculous and what is difficult for us. But again, you've heard me say this in the classes back down the hall, so those of you that are, some of you weren't in those classes, so this is new material for some of you, but which is harder for God? To raise somebody from the dead or to make sure I have someone encouraging me? Which is harder for God? There's no difference. With God, all things are possible, right? Now, to me, you can say, Corey, I need you to go encourage Danny. He's an elder and he needs to be encouraged. I can do that. Probably don't do it enough, but I can do that. If you said, Johnny Shanklin's dead in the hallway, go raise him from the dead, I'm sorry, Johnny, we're back to the same boat. You're in trouble, buddy, you know. Because I can't do that. But God, there's no difference in those things. It's just as easy for God to split the Red Sea as it is to make sure that someone's there to pray with me. So he just puts them all in the same group. Now, how many of you have ever heard, a preacher or teacher say there were 9 spiritual gifts brought by the Holy Spirit? Have you heard that one before? Maybe this is another one of those where I wasn't paying attention good when I was younger. But there's 7 in this list. And here's the problem, and we'll go to here and hit play. Here's the ones from Romans chapter 12 that we just looked at. Here's the 7: prophecy, serving, teaching, exhorting, contributing, leading, and mercy. But if you look at, and we don't have time tonight to look at all of these, but if we were to look at all of the different lists in Romans, there's a list that has 9. In 1 Corinthians, there's a list in 1 Corinthians 12 that has 9, but if you keep reading down further, there's another list that's got some more. And then you look at Ephesians chapter 4, and he lists some other ones. And there's some of these that are repeated in this list, like prophecy and prophets. That's twice in 1 Corinthians 12. It's again in Romans 12. It's again in Ephesians 4. And you've got teaching that's in 1 Corinthians 12 and Romans 12 and Ephesians 4, and apostles is in 1 Corinthians 12 and Ephesians 4, but it's not in Romans 12. So what's the deal? Well, if you add them all up, there's one that's mentioned 4 times, one that's mentioned 3 times, one that's mentioned 2 times. The way that I count it, in those 3 lists, there's 19 spiritual gifts. And we would say some of those are miraculous and some of those are non-miraculous, but Paul just puts them all in the same basket and says, here's gifts. And in 1 Corinthians 12, he says the gifts that each one of us has. So if each one of us has a gift, then how many of us have a gift? All of us. Some maybe more than one gift. Are you still with me? Now I know your head's spinning right now, but we'll make times for questions at the end of all this. So there's lots of passages to consider. In 1 Corinthians 12, if you look in 1 Corinthians 12, you're going to see that he calls them 4 different things. He calls them gifts because there's something that God has given to us. Okay? And you're thinking, wait a minute, I get like teaching might be a gift or being an apostle might be a gift, but mercy, is that a gift? Do you know people that are really good at showing mercy? I'm not. Sometimes when I go, and I'm thankful for the book of Job, because in Job, the 3 friends, they did their best work when they just sat there and said nothing. So I don't put too much pressure on myself anymore about knowing the right things to say. But, you know, if George is in the hospital and I go, I'm always like, am I saying the right thing or should I said something different? And Melody can walk in a room and everybody feels automatically at home with her. She's got a gift of mercy. There's people that I know in my life that have the gift of encouragement. Every Sunday and Sunday night when I walk down through there, Eddie Cassidy, who I also think has the gift of preaching and ministry and teaching, but Eddie Cassidy every time puts that fist up and then he'll come back and man, I love that sermon. Here's what I loved about that. Brags on it more than it needs to be bragged on because he's an encourager. Every Sunday night, she won't like me telling you this, but every Sunday night I get a text message, and every Sunday night we get home and we fix popcorn and we turn on a football game, and my phone will buzz and I'll say, there's Tina. And Melody will laugh and I'll look, and it's great lessons today. Appreciate you and all you do. That's a gift of encouraging. I know people that have a great gift for management. Do you know those? That they can organize things and do things, get things done. See, all of these different gifts we can do because God gave them to us. And then they're called service or ministries because we're supposed to use them in the ministry that God has given the church. He calls them activities or workings. They're things that we do to show God's power working in us. They're manifestations of the Spirit. They're showing how God is working through the Spirit in our lives. Okay? And there's a bunch of different passages, and this is the list. And if you want the copy of this, you don't want to write it all down, just tell me and I'll send it to you. But like in Exodus chapter 35, verse 30 and following, when they get ready to build the tabernacle, it talks about how that there were some that God empowered with gifts that were able to do certain skills, certain activities to help build. Aren't you glad there's people like that? All of the cabinets that are in our house, I've been told at least, that you built them. Now, if I had to build those cabinets, they'd hold stuff, but they wouldn't look as pretty as the ones he built in there. Aren't you glad there's people that have those talents? Well, just take the credit and go for it, you know. Somebody had that talent, though, didn't he? Huh? But maybe he had the talent of organization and leading. He administered, made sure it got done. My point is, though, is that there's some people that have those gifts. Can you use those gifts to help grow the church and help do the work of the Lord? Yes. Acts chapter 6, there's the account of, the Grecian widows aren't getting fed. And Peter and the other disciples, when they start griping, they say, now look, we need to appoint some men to take care of this because we don't have time to be waiting on tables. Now, is it that Peter thought that he was too good to deliver meals to widows? Of course not. But Peter had a different kind of gift, didn't he? He was an apostle, and he was a preacher, and he was a teacher, and he was a prophet. And if he spends all his time doing that, he's not going to have time to preach and teach. We need to devote ourselves, he says, to ministry and prayer. I think, and I'm not trying to be haughty, I'm not the best at any of these, but I think I have a gift of teaching. And I think I have a gift of evangelism. I do. I don't say that to brag about me, because I've got it because God gave it to me. And if you're in ministry, and we've got lots of retired preachers in our congregation, thankfully, if you're at a church long enough, Eddie, you're going to unstop a toilet every now and again, right? And you're going to take out a bag of trash every now and again. But if I spent all my time doing that, I wouldn't have time to preach and teach, would I? Then you've got, like in Acts chapter 8, you've got, well, I'll be dog. Philip is up in Samaria and preaching and teaching and baptizing people, and then they have to send Peter and John up there to lay hands so they could receive the gift of the Holy Spirit. And we're jumping out of context with a different author and the way he's using it, but there's really two things. He's prophesying and speaking in tongues that he wants passed along to them. And those particular gifts were something that we see passed by the apostles' hands. In Acts chapter 19 is very similar. Those folks at Ephesus that had been baptized in John's baptism rather than the Great Commission baptism, and they're baptized. Well, Acts 2:38 says when you're baptized, you receive the gift of the Holy Spirit. But Paul laid his hands on them so they would receive the Spirit. So it must be something different, right? And then they begin to prophesy and speak in tongues. 1 Corinthians 13 tells us that whenever the perfect has come, and we talked about in our classes back there, that's God's Word. When it's completed, three different things. Prophecy will cease, tongues will cease, and special knowledge will cease. And we're thinking, Paul, why didn't you say all gifts of the Spirit would cease? Have you ever wondered that? I think Paul would say it's because I didn't mean all spiritual gifts would cease. But those three would. And then in Mark chapter 16 and in Hebrews chapter 2, in both of those places, he tells us that there are some miracles, some gifts that they were doing that were to confirm the Word. Now, what were those? Ask me what they were. I don't know, because he didn't tell us. He just says that there were some that confirmed the Word. Then in 1 Corinthians chapter 14, he tells us that we ought to desire spiritual gifts. And then he tells us in 1 Corinthians 14, we ought to ask God for spiritual gifts. And then in 1 Corinthians 12, in those three verses, he tells us three times we can desire them and we can ask for them, but ultimately God's going to give us whatever gifts that He wants us to have. Like, I'd love to be a song leader. I love singing. If you're around me during Christmas time, I'm singing Christmas songs in my office, and Webb will often stop by my door and he'll say, "Now, I'm not paid enough to have to listen to you do that." You know. The problem is I sing way better in the shower. If I could lead singing from the baptistry, I'd be a much better song leader. But I'd love to lead singing the way that Tucker does. But it's not my talent. It's not my gift. It's not my ability. See? God's going to give me what gifts He wants me to have. And why does He give it? Well, in Ephesians 4, He tells us. In 1 Corinthians 12, He tells us. And in Romans 12, He tells us. It's so that the church can do the work that it needs to, that it can grow. So of all of those, and I'll go back a slide, of all of those 19, I don't think, now understand what I'm saying, we've talked about this before, there's things that I know and things that I think and things that I don't know. The things that I know, I can book chapter and verse. The things that I think are based on some principles in the Bible, but the things that I don't know is the things the Bible don't say anything about, okay? I think that there's probably a lot more than 19 spiritual gifts. Because I think, based on what the Bible says, God gives us the gifts that we need to do the work of the church. Okay? So if there's a need in the church, He's going to give us the gifts that we need. Now, that doesn't mean we're going to use them. Sometimes we don't. But He's going to give us what we need. So, here's the way that I think we could categorize this. There are some that explicitly He's told us are done. In 1 Corinthians 13, when the perfect has come, that's the Word of God, then those three gifts of knowledge and prophecy and tongues are done away with. There are some, it's implied, if some of those gifts were for confirming the Word, once the Word's been confirmed, we don't need those anymore, right? But a lot of those things, do we still need people that can show mercy? Do we still need evangelists? Do we still need elders? Do we still need people that can encourage and give and serve and lots of other things? So, it's a very American thing to say, well, I taught myself how to do that, and I've just, But it's a biblical thing to recognize, not to think more highly of myself than I ought to think, or, putting you on the spot now, not to be wise in my own sight, or not to be proud. You remember his? His was shorter, wasn't it? Or not to be boastful, right? And realize that what we have, God has given us. So we've done a lot of talking kind of out of context of Romans 12, but I did that to help us to see that we do a poor job in the church of helping teach this, because we want to win the debate of spiritual gifts and charismatic movements and all that. And what we end up doing is we tell people, and wherever Kirk and Wade is, they're not going to hate me for saying this in front of everybody, but we tell, well, everybody ought to be teachers. But everybody ought not to be teachers. Have you ever sat in a class with somebody that didn't have the gift for teaching? Some of you are saying, I am right now, Some people don't need to be teaching. And some people don't need to be evangelizing. And some people, bless their heart, they try to encourage. You're having an appendectomy tomorrow? Well, I'll be praying for you, brother. My uncle had one of them. He died on the table, They want to encourage, but they're just not good at it, Well, if we help people see that, remember what he said in 1 Corinthians 12, who has a gift? Each one of us. Help people find what their gifts are so we can use them for God's glory. Otherwise, we tell everybody, you got to teach. Well, I can't teach as good as Webb and Danny. Well, you need to be leading singing. Well, I can't lead singing as good as Tucker can or Carrie can. Well, you need to be an elder. Well, I can't be an elder as good as and we make them feel like there's nothing they can do, so we wonder why 10% of the people do 90% of the work and 90% of the people do 10% of the work. It's because we've made them think that unless you can do this like him, that may not be your gift. I don't know if y'all saw the other day, one of the LSU offensive linemen was being interviewed after their bowl game, and he said, if a defensive lineman makes one sack a game, he'll play in the NFL. Isn't that right? And he said, as an offensive lineman, if I give up one sack a game, I'll be working for Amazon. Now, they have different roles, don't they? And understanding that in a football team, understanding that in a basketball team or a baseball team, it's, a no-brainer, or in a business or in a community or whatever. But that's what he's trying to tell us in this section here in Romans 12. It's the same idea with that we would see as common sense in every other aspect, is that we've all got gifts and we need each other. Because I know what gifts that I have. I also, when I recognize that, I know what gifts I don't have. See? And I need you to use your gifts that you have, and I'll use my gifts that I have, and then you ever heard the quarterback at the end of the game, he throws for 400 yards and wins, and a lot of times, hopefully, this is what they say, well, I couldn't have done it without my offensive lineman. Isn't that right? I played offensive line a little bit, and that quarterback gets too cocky, you start doing the Olay. You know the Olay move? It's, hey, there he is. You know, he's not going to throw for anything at that point. If we understand how important we are to each other, how that we're members of one another, that what I'm doing, I don't have any right to brag on because I can't preach or teach or lead singing or whatever it is because I'm so good because of what God has given to me through the Spirit. Then I don't think more highly of myself. I bring my opinion of myself down, and I realize how important you are, and I bring my opinion, and that's when we start having this. And that's what he's trying to get across in the book of Romans, is that don't think of yourself in two bodies, you're one body. And everybody, I don't care if you're a nose, I don't care if you're an ear, or if you're an elbow, or if you're an eyeball, or what you are, you're important to this body. And we need you to use your gift. And when we do that together and appreciate each other and love each other, then we have harmony, and God is glorified, and the work of the church rolls on. You ever hear that old bluegrass song, Let the Church Roll On? It will when we understand this. All right. I've actually gone 3 minutes over, but I don't mind staying and asking questions, and if I don't know the answers, then Danny or Johnny will give you the answers afterwards, okay? So if you have questions, please feel free to come up here and ask, and we'll address them maybe next week, and we'll move forward in Romans 12. We're going to close down our online services at this point, and those of you that are online, we are glad that you've joined us. Hope you can be with us in person. We don't have very many announcements to make you aware of, those of you that are here, but we do want to talk about a few things, and then